Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about our Including Communities 2025 programme, which is some community grant funding. We are presenting from the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation today, and my name is Joanne Davis. I'm the grants manager. So this is a 60-minute webinar for those who are seeing it live. It's going to be a shorter recording for those of you who are watching it, because we're going to have some Q&As at the end. What we're going to do in probably the next half an hour is do a brief introduction to who we are, the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. We're going to have a detailed look at the criteria for including communities. We're going to dive a little bit more into what makes a good bid with some examples and case studies. And as I say, we'll stop the recording and there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. So briefly, lots of you will be very familiar with us, so I won't loiter too long on this slide. But we are the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Foundation. The UK has 47 community foundations dotted geographically across. And this means we are a place-based funder. So all of our funding covers in different ways, Hampshire, Southampton, Portsmouth, and the Isle of Wight. We manage multiple grant programmes that you will see come live on our website throughout the year. Our key remit is to support very localised grassroots community organisations. An awful lot of our funding opportunities have an income cap, so we are tending to fund smaller organisations with an income under £1 million. That's not always the case. There are some exceptions, but this fund today is targeted at grassroots community organisations. Our core aim, and we'll come on to talk about our aims and impact framework a little bit more in a minute, is to tackle poverty and inequality. And to give you an idea of scale, unfortunately, we're not the size of people like the lottery. We work on calendar years. So in 2024, from January to December, we made 250 grants totaling about 1.1 million. And we're expecting a similar picture potentially for 2025. We're a very small organisation. You're hearing now from me, Joanne Davis, the grants manager, and we've also on this call got Catherine Gardner, who's our grants administrator. That's the entire grants team, and we're both part-time. We don't work Fridays, so if you're trying to get in touch with us, Fridays is not a great day to contact the grants team. We have other staff who can field your inquiries. Jackie Scott, many of you will be familiar with, is our CEO. And as I said, Millie is also on our call today, and she's our comms manager. So those are the people who you'll be most in contact with at the organisation. I like to include this slide when I'm talking about the types of things that we fund, because one of the questions that we had back in 2023 is how we think about communicating what sorts of things that we fund, because we fund a whole range of community activity. So we would fund things with young people, older people, we would fund one-to-one work like counselling in some cases, we would fund group work, in some cases we would fund events. We have a range of funding programmes across the year, and we wanted to think about what tied all of that funding together. So we're just going to talk very quickly about our impact framework, and this is important not just for applying for including communities, but applying for any of our grant programmes. So in 2023, as I say, we came up with what we call our impact framework, and we decided that the golden thread underpinning all of our grant making is poverty and inequality. So every bid that comes in that we look at, we will always ask ourselves the question of how is it tackling poverty and inequality? So if you're applying for including communities, you could automatically consider how your project will reach those people who, for example, might be on low incomes or might be isolated. They might face barriers and challenges to being involved. We don't ask you to tick all of those boxes. So it could be that you're working with a demographic that face particular challenges because they might have a disability, or you might be working with a particular demographic who are isolated, maybe through older age, or again, something like a disability, or you could be working with people who are on low incomes. So in any bid that you submit to us, always just ask yourself, am I making it clear how I'm tackling poverty and inequality in my work? We knew that poverty and inequality didn't cover really all of our work, and we needed something more slightly sophisticated than that. So we came up with 5 other impact themes that sit alongside that. I won't go through all of them because not all of them are relevant to including communities, but the impact theme that you need to think about when you're putting in your including communities bid is one that we call flourishing communities. And that means that every bid that comes into Including Communities needs to show how it funds work that involves and connects people, local services and activities. So you might also be touching on some of our other impact themes. We know that there are lots of kind of overlap and kind of Venn diagram of how all of these things interact, and that you might be doing something that also improves people's health or improves people's skills. But the key thing you need to be asking yourself when you put in an Including Communities bid is, will your work involve and connect people, local services or activities? So looking more at Including Communities, which is what the focus of this presentation today is going to be on, we're going to look at the logistics of how to apply, so dates, timings, etc. We're going to look at the criteria, and we're going to look at some examples of kind of case studies of what people have applied for before. So the key things that everyone needs to know when applying for a fund is, when does it open and close? So Including Communities is open already. It opened on the 18th of August and it will close on the 30th of September. All of our grant programmes close at midnight on that advertised day. So you'll be able to submit an application right up until midnight. If it's submitted after that point, we do have the ability to say that that is ineligible and not take it forward. So that will be a hard closing date. We're not a funder that will close early. I know that some funders are bringing in kind of caps where when they've reached a certain number of bids, they'll close it. Ours won't close early, so it will stay open until the 30th of September. This is an annual fund, so if you're wanting to apply for Including Communities, this will be your only point in 2025, and we will reopen something similar in 2026 because it's an annual fund. A really other important thing to note about dates is that when you're thinking about what you're applying for, we obviously, as all funders do, have a lead-in process of how long it will take us to make a grant decision. So we will not notify awarded grantees until probably late November. So all of the applications will go through a grants process. We have a grants policy on our website if you wanted to read more detail about what that process looks like. But in a nutshell, they're read internally, they're assessed, and then they go to a panel. So that panel is not meeting until late November, so you will not get funding before that point. So when you're thinking about what you would like to apply for, we're really ideally looking for you to be kickstarting your projects probably January 26. And because this is 12-month funding, you can run them until January 2027. You don't have to run them through each of those 12 months, but that's the window in which you can have the funding. In terms of the grant size, this is a programme for grants between 1,000 and 10,000. Again, that's a hard cap, so we will not be making grants over £10,000. And it's a potential eligibility thing that if you apply to us for £20,000, we could potentially remove that application. So make sure you're capping your project budget at £10,000. We've also put a footnote on there that because we encourage small and new organisations to apply for this fund, we want you to think about the proportionate amount that you apply for. So if you're a very small organisation and you only have an income of £10,000, you will not be eligible to apply for a £10,000 grant, because we will look at the grant as a ratio of your annual income. So we will not fund more than 30% of your last recorded income. So as an example, we would not make a 10 grand grant to an organisation with an income smaller than £33,000. So you can still apply, just pro rata it down, so you're applying for a smaller proportionate amount. If you've got specific questions about that, Kat and I can obviously run the figures for you if you want to come to us with particular examples, but it's just really to stop tiny organisations essentially applying for a whole year's worth of kind of running costs from us. The fund details in terms of locations are that it covers all of our HIWCF geographies. So you can be based in Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton and the Isle of Wight, or you can be based in obviously a mix of those. So you can be working across those areas. We are a place-based funder. So lots of people say, oh, I'm a London-based charity, but I do have a project in Portsmouth. That's really not who we're targeting for this programme. What we're really trying to target are organisations which ideally should have the majority of their operations and their HQ kind of within our geography. We appreciate that communities don't kind of stop at a borderline of where one county meets another. So it's absolutely fine if you're working on the perimeters of our geographies and you have a small number of people who might be, say, from Surrey coming to your project if you're kind of at the north of Hampshire. But what we want to see is that you really have a key focus in both your kind of core organisation operations and your project on those areas. One of the things that is really important to stress with a very popular program like this is what we would call our basic eligibility. So any of you that have applied to us on one of our open programs before will know that we have a really simple tick box eligibility section that you're automatically channeled through before you get to the application form. So once you click the apply button on our website, you will automatically be taken to this. And it should, as I say, it's a tick box thing. It should take you no longer than kind of a minute or two to kind of fill in. And the aim of the eligibility tick box is to really kind of filter out organisations that we know will immediately not be eligible. And ideally, it will save you some time because we don't want you wasting your precious resources applying for a programme that you're not going to be eligible for. So the types of things that it will ask you are the type of organisation that's applying. So we can fund charities, charitable incorporated organisation, KICs limited by guarantee, companies limited by guarantee, and constituted community groups. Again, if you've got questions about that, we can field those at the end. In terms of how your organisation is run and the governance of it, we're looking for you to have 3 or more people involved in your top line governance. You should have a bank account in your organisation's name. We will also ask about good practice policies. The 2 that we ask you to supply with your application are a safeguarding policy and some sort of EDI or diversity policy, you might call it a different name. Key things that we see time and time again with those policies, which if you're applying to any funder is really good practice, is please make sure your policies are dated. If your policy comes in without a date on it, we don't know whether you wrote that 10 years ago or whether you wrote it 10 weeks ago. And we're ideally looking for those policies to be live and active. So it's a really good tip when applying to any funder who asks for your policies to make sure they're dated and have a review point on them. There's also really good practice about making sure that you've got, for example, yes, review points, key people within your organisation who are responsible for those policies. And the other thing that we will ask at this point is that, do you have an income under £1 million? We do run a small number of programmes that allow organisations over £1 million. We've got one in the New Forest, Charles Burnett, for example, that sometimes allows over £1 million. But for this programme, you will be capped at having an income of £1 million. If you've got questions about being on the borderline of that, for example, some organisations might have just tipped over or under that. Again, that's the sort of thing you can put in the chat and Catherine might be able to help you with, or we can have a look at you on a case-by-case basis. But do be aware that if you've got an income of over £1 million, you will be seen as ineligible. So in a nutshell, it's useful to share with you what Including Communities is looking to fund. If you remember back to those impact frameworks that I talked about, it comes under flourishing communities. So that's what our kind of big aim is, that we are wanting to help build flourishing and connected communities. So all of this wording is in the criteria on the website. We think that communities thrive when local community activities and services regularly bring together people, and when those activities and services are shaped by local people or people from their target community. So I've underlined certain things here, which we'll go over in a bit more detail because they form some of that kind of core criteria of kind of how we're defining the difference between kind of an okay bid and a really strong bid. So we have come up with what we would call 3 programme criteria for Including Communities, and this is all within the criteria document that's on the website. So we're not necessarily introducing anything new today. We're just talking through the things that are already on our website. So the 3 things which we call programme criteria that you need to make sure that you're ticking when you put in an Including Communities bid. The first one, and it goes back to those impact themes, is that you need to make sure that your work reaches people who are living hard and challenging lives. Now, we are quite a generalist funder, so we don't want to define what hard and challenging looks like. It could be that those people are living in poverty. It could be that those people are facing discrimination. It could be that those people are isolated. So it's up to you to make a case for how you feel that the group that you're working with meets that case. You know, if you're working with care leavers, how are care leavers living hard and challenging lives? If you're working with older people, how is that group of people living hard and challenging lives? It could be that they're housebound. It could be that they've lost their support networks. If you're working with young people, how are they living hard and challenging lives? It could be that they're having free school dinners. It could be that they're living in homes which are facing poverty. It could be that they're living in single parent homes where, you know, that could be they're excluded from school. There's a whole range of factors that you could throw into the mix to kind of evidence why you think the target group that you're working are living hard and challenging lives. The second area that we would like people to think about is does your work regularly bring together members of the community? So as I mentioned in the introduction, we are, as a funder, will fund things like counselling and one-to-one work, but we won't fund it within this particular programme. So what we're looking for from this programme is work that brings people together. And examples of that would be things like support groups, social action projects, volunteering initiatives, community groups. We're going to go through some case studies later to kind of hopefully bring that alive. But something like a youth group would be a really great example of work that brings people together on a regular basis, because that youth group could be weekly. It could have, you know, a regular cohort of young people turning up to it. So that's the sort of model that we're looking for from Including Communities. We're not looking for work that is one-off. So if you tell us that you want funding for a one-off carnival event, that is not suitable for Including Communities. If you tell us that you want work which is one-to-one, like debt advice or counselling services, that is not going to be eligible within this programme. It might be within other programmes that we fund, but not within this one. And the third criteria that we've got is that we want your target communities to have helped shape this work. So we think it's really important that you're not just kind of parachuting in with a project and saying, actually, we think young people would really like this activity, because actually, have you asked young people what they would be interested in, for example? So we're not necessarily looking for, again, kind of like a tick box list of things. You could have done your consultation in all sorts of ways. It could be that you have a suggestion jar that young people put ideas in. It could be that you've got, you've done an online survey to people. It could be that you've got people from your community as kind of like reps or volunteers on the project, kind of helping to shape it. It could be that your organisation is led by local people or people from that target community. So there's lots of different ways that you can show us that. And again, we're happy to answer questions if you would like particular examples that might be useful for your organisation. People always ask us when I'm putting my budget together, because obviously budget is a key part of your bid, what types of things will you fund? So what can you actually get the money for? A lot of the funding that we give out in Including Communities is for staff costs. So we can fund a range of things under staff costs. We can fund full-time, part-time sessional staff. Because we're obviously only funding £10,000 grants, it's very unlikely, obviously, that you're going to get the entirety of a full-time or even a part-time staff member for that. So quite often we are acknowledging that we are funding part of a worker. So it could be that you've got a youth worker or a support worker and they work 20 hours a week, and we might be funding them for 5 of those hours, for example, to run the particular project that you're applying for. We can fund sessional staff as well. So that by sessional, we would mean staff that have kind of variable hours that you're kind of maybe just bringing in for a particular project. We can also fund volunteer costs. We absolutely know that volunteers are not free to organisations, that they should be claiming expenses and out-of-pocket costs, that volunteers obviously benefit from training, DBS checks, all those sorts of things. So every time you're using volunteers on your project, think about whether you need to be covering costs for them within this project budget. The other heading that we see quite a lot on Including Communities is activity costs. So this is all the things that you need to help run your project. So it would include things like room hire, publicity materials. Do you need transport costs to get your beneficiaries to the project? Do you need to give your beneficiaries refreshments? That's always a really popular thing to do when you're bringing people together. So we can fund biscuits, teas and coffees, all those sorts of things can be popped onto your activity budget. We've also got a line for core costs. It's useful for me to define what core costs mean. So we will, as a funder, always consider a contribution to what we would call your overheads. So those are the costs that would be in place whether or not you ran the project. So in the example of a youth club, it might be that your organisation has, senior managers or a chief executive or finance worker or an admin worker. Those people would be in place whether or not your youth club ran. So we can make a contribution towards those. Quite often people say, what's an appropriate contribution? What sort of percentage would you look at? Again, quite often it is on a case-by-case basis, but I would say that we would be really happy with an organisation considering around the 20% mark of their project budget to be on core costs. And you should ideally in your bid kind of indicate what that might be, whether it is kind of core staffing or whether you've got a building that you're having to maintain and run that it might be going towards. So yeah, put a little bit of detail about what sort of core costs you have, but we're really happy to contribute towards that. The last item on the budget is equipment. We have to note here that we are not an equipment or capital funder. So if you're putting in a bid for £10,000 for a ride-on mower or £10,000 to repair a church roof, that's not the sort of thing that we would be able to fund. But if you are a youth group, for example, and you want, I don't know, some small pieces of sports equipment or something to help your youth club run, those are the sorts of bits of equipment that we can consider. So as it notes on the slide, we rarely fund individual items of equipment over £1,000. So we are looking for smaller pieces of equipment, and all of them should be clearly linked to helping you run that project. So helping bring people together. So this is a quick summary of, again, the things that we will not fund. So we've talked a lot about how we are a place-based funder and wanting to fund local. So this fund is not suitable for national charities where branches cannot demonstrate local independence. So we know that some organisations do have a branch structure, and we will fund branches of larger national organisations, such as, for example, Home Start might be an example, as long as those local branches are independent and separately set up. So we might be able to fund a New Forest based Home Start if it could show, for example, that it's got its own bank account, its own governance, and yeah, it's kind of part of a wider model, but still independent. What we won't be able to fund is if you're just a project as part of a national charity. We've just touched on the fact we won't fund big piece of equipment or refurbishment work. Again, we're a place-based funder, so we will absolutely give priority to community organisations solely based in and delivering work in Hampshire, Portsmouth, Southampton and Isle of Wight. And as I said earlier, we know that geography is complex and that you might have some people crossing borders from, kind of Surrey, etc., at the top of North, or kind of Dorset, kind of maybe on the other side. But you really should be indicating that your primary focus is on supporting communities within those locations. We've talked a lot about this being a fund about bringing people together on a regular basis. So just a reminder, we won't fund one-off or infrequent events. And we will not fund work that is seen as statutory or profit-making. So we won't fund work with young people, for example, which happens during the school day, because we would see that as a statutory requirement. If young people are excluded from school or outside of school, then absolutely you can make a clear case for that. And we won't fund work that is profit making. You can make small charges for projects. So if you're having cups of tea, you can say people can put a contribution in, etc. And that can go back towards sustaining and running the project. But what you shouldn't be doing is aiming to make an overall profit as part of the project. One of the things that we are kind of keen to talk about this year that we haven't always included in our webinars is very clear statistics about kind of how many bids we get and the likelihood of funding. And I think this is sometimes a double-edged sword for funders, because obviously what we don't want to do is discourage everyone from applying and get no bids, but we also want to be really transparent about the level of bids that we do get in. So including communities, as we said, is an annual fund, and we are seeing every year a year-on-year rise in demand. So in 2024, we received 126 bids, and we read and shortlist all of those bids. What we have to do, just because of the scale of what we're working on, is we don't assess all of those. We work out which are the strongest. So we felt that 54 of those most strongly met that programme criteria that I talked through earlier. And then we take those to panel once they've been assessed. And our panel agreed 18 grants, which was a full spend of our total pot last year, which was £143,000. We are very unlikely to have significantly more money than that this year. We're looking at very similar amounts, kind of year on year of funding. So we don't want to discourage people from applying, but we also want you to go into it with your eyes open that this is a competitive fund, and we want you, when you're putting in your bid, to keep thinking about, does this fit the criteria? Because if it doesn't fit the criteria, you're going to be in that first cut where we do the shortlisting and we say this doesn't strongly meet that criteria, and you might not make it even through to the assessment stage. When we run these webinars, what we are aiming to do is, this isn't necessarily kind of a publicity or promotion webinar where we're trying to get bids in. We know that we will always have far more bids, unfortunately, than we can fund. So really what the point of this webinar is I guess to help you make the strongest bid and that best meets the criteria, and in some cases to actually think this isn't the fund for you. So it might be a really good use of your time to come to this webinar and think, actually, this isn't the best fund for me. I'm going to touch on a few other funds at the end that we do run, and it might be that there's another funding opportunity that is far better for you than applying for this one. So I talked about the fact that we funded 18 projects last year to 143,000, and it would be really useful, some people say, to find out what was funded. So I've done kind of two really short case studies. Millie, our comms manager, is really great in putting lots of content on our website about the sorts of things that we fund as well, and on social media. So if you're not signed up to our social media channels, it's always really worth signing up to that, because that quite often does give you a week by week kind of snapshot quite often of the sorts of things we fund and the types of kind of case studies of our work. But these two are kind of actual case studies of what we funded, real life projects in 2024. So the first one was a community cafe hub for older adults. We gave it £10,000. It's run by a CIO based in Basingstoke. The funding was to run a weekly community day hub for vulnerable older people. So it was offering kind of social interactions, which involved cake, obviously very important, as I said, refreshments on a budget, bingo, music, quizzes, etc. They were hoping that they would be able to bring, say, 30 people together a week, but of course, across the course of the year, they might reach kind of near 100, appreciating that not everyone will necessarily be able to come every week. The sessions were ticking that flourishing communities box because they were bringing people together and they were reducing isolation. So the types of things that we were looking for in that bid is, who are they targeting? They're targeting older people who are isolated. And is their budget matching that? Yes, we felt their budget was matching that because they were clearly showing that they wanted funding to help run weekly sessions. So they were applying, for example, for a community project leader and room hire and maybe some small consumables for the activity sessions. The second case study is a local housing estate project that was running gardening and community days for all ages, and they got £9,016. That was a charity in Gosport. And they had funding to run these regular community development activities, which had a whole range of different themes. Some of it was gardening, some of it was just socialising. They made a really clear case that it was a deprived ward and that the areas that the people they were tackling in that area would be on low incomes, living hard and challenging lives. They talked about how they were going to regularly reach local residents on a sustained and regular basis. And their budget was really clear again, showing how they were wanting funding to make that possible. So they were funding a development worker to actually run those sessions and organise those sessions. And they were asking for small items of equipment, such as gardening, things like trowels, seeds, etc. Both projects, also going back to that programme criteria, were able to show how local people had shaped that work. So it wasn't just the organisation saying, we think this is a good idea. They were able to say, we've spoken to local people and we think that this would be really, really useful to do. One of the things that I probably haven't touched on, which people quite often ask, is does this have to be new or can this be existing work that we fund? And we will fund both. So you can come to us with a new idea, as long as, again, you're showing that that idea is viable and you've consulted about it, or you can run something that you've been running for a number of years that you know is successful and well needed. So we're not wanting you to reinvent the wheel. You can actually, absolutely say this youth club or support group has been running for a number of years and we would like funding to continue that. I think I've probably covered lots of these things before, but again, Kat and I, when we're reading the applications, find it absolutely heartbreaking if people have spent a lot of time working on a bid and we know immediately from reading a couple of lines that it's not going to be eligible. So it's worth repeating. We won't fund work that is one-to-one, like counselling or debt advice. We won't fund one-off or infrequent events, which always have new audiences. We won't fund building or refurbishment costs. We won't fund large items of equipment. You have to think about your ratio of your income. So we're not going to make a £10,000 grant to you if you're saying you're new and you've got no income in the pot at the moment. And we won't fund retrospective work. So think about when your project will start and time it with the November panel that we're running. So I'm going to end just by briefly talking about kind of a few other funding programs that are kind of coming up or that we're running that you could apply for. So lots of you who are familiar with us as a funder will know that we run annual funds every year, as annual funds are, in the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth. So look out for those. We've already had them for 2025, but they'll be opening potentially in spring 26. In January 2026, we'll open our annual sport and activity fund. So that's called Get Active, Get Involved. Many of you will be familiar with that. So it's around, again, involving people who face barriers to being involved in sport. It gives them a really good opportunity, to do kind of more inclusive and accessible projects. We've got some targeted funding over the next couple of years for the New Forest from a legacy donation, so look out for that coming up again. We've got some heritage lottery funding to do some work with heritage groups on the Isle of Wight. So we've already run one round of that and we'll be reopening that potentially at the end of 2025, early 26. And whilst we are not predominantly an individual grant maker, we do have a few funding threads around individual grants. So one of those is around work with care leavers. So if you work with care leavers, it might be worth you just having a look at our website and seeing what we cover. And we also have some funding from a great donor called SWAF, which is for working with young entrepreneurs aged 18 to 30. So again, you might be a youth organisation or a skills and employability organisation working with young people, or you might be a young person yourself. Do have a look at our website for our SWAF funding. The other thing that we always flag with organisations is that a lot of our income every year goes out to work that donors who have given us money have requested particular work to link with their kind of donor wishes. So quite often we will work with a donor to identify projects to meet their needs. So we're doing that kind of throughout the year as well. So these are some contact details at the end for us. You can contact us by phone. We've got a grants admin email address, and that's our website as well. We are on social media as well, so do have a look at social media. We've got loads of really great resources on the website. Kat asked me to remind everyone that one of the things that we've just popped onto the website this week is that we've always had a document called application form guidance, which actually takes you through all the questions in our application form. And we've always had it on the website on a PDF, which isn't always necessarily that useful for people. We've added it to the website as a Word document so people can download that. And what that enables you to do is to be able to see all of the questions in advance that we ask in the application form, lists all the supporting documents that would be asked for, and you can, I guess, do a draft of your application offline so you can share it with colleagues before you submit it. You can't submit it using that Word document, but it's a really useful planning tool. So absolutely do have a look at our website because there's lots of information on there. There's also an ability on our website to sign up for our grants newsletter. So again, have a look on the website, and that will be a really great way of staying in contact with all of the funding programs that we open throughout the year. So thank you for listening. Really appreciated. And yeah, do get in contact if you've got more questions. Thank you.